Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you are from and what time you are watching. And did you know that 97% of you guys watching aren't subscribed yet? So make sure to subscribe and like. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Haldemand Frequency. In March of 2019, a radio enthusiast named Petra Voslo moved into a farmhouse outside Cayuga in Haldemand County. She'd purchased the property for almost nothing, a rambling structure built in 1923 that came with 40 acres of untended fields and a barn that leaned so severely it seemed to defy physics. Petra worked remotely as a data analyst and spent her evenings pursuing her real passion, scanning shortwave radio frequencies for number stations, mysterious broadcasts that had fascinated her since childhood. The farmhouse had no internet infrastructure, which suited Petra perfectly. She installed a massive antenna array in the backyard, drawing curious stares from her nearest neighbor, a taciturn dairy farmer named Gerald, who lived 2 miles down the road. Gerald warned her once, standing at her property line on a gray April morning, that the previous owners had left suddenly. When Petra asked why, he simply shook his head and walked away. She began noticing the interference on her third night. Around 11:15 p.m., every frequency between 4.7 and 5.1 megahertz would fill with a peculiar static that sounded almost wet, like rain falling on something soft. Petra recorded it, ran it through analysis software, and found something impossible. Embedded in the static were fragments of human speech, but reversed and layered over itself so many times that it created a hideous gargling texture. She became obsessed with isolating the voices. Night after night, she worked until dawn, slowly peeling back layers of sound. By late April, she could make out individual words. They were speaking English, but the syntax was wrong. Phrases like the beneath, soil remembers, and counting the buried stones repeated endlessly. Then she isolated a name. Her name. The recording was clear. A woman's voice, distant and hollow, saying, "Petra Voslu will understand when she finds the broadcast room." She checked her property records, her social media, anything that might explain how her name could appear in a radio transmission. Nothing made sense. The shortwave frequencies she monitored were used by governments and military installations, not local pranksters. The next night, she decided to triangulate the source. Using a directional antenna, she swept across her property, watching the signal strength meter. The transmission was strongest when she pointed the antenna at her own barn. Petra crossed the dark field with a flashlight, her breath visible in the cold May air. The barn door hung open, creaking softly. Inside, she found the expected detritus of abandoned farm life: rotting hay bales, rusted equipment, birds nesting in the rafters. But in the far corner, hidden behind a collapsed workbench, she discovered a door set into the floor. The wooden hatch was locked, but the wood was so decayed that it splintered under her pry bar. Stone steps descended into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from below was organic and old, like a root cellar that had been sealed for decades. Petra's flashlight beam showed rough stone walls glistening with moisture. At the bottom of the steps, she found a room that had no reason to exist. The space was perhaps 12 feet square, with walls made of smooth concrete that looked far newer than the barn above. In the center stood a radio transmitter, a massive unit that looked military in origin, still connected to a car battery that somehow held a charge. The equipment was running. Dozens of papers were tacked to the walls, covered in handwritten notes. Petra recognized the same phrases from her recordings, but these pages contained more: instructions, coordinates, and a date. May 7, 1987. She checked her phone. Today was May 6th, 2019. The notes described something called the Hall demand frequency, a specific radio wavelength that supposedly allowed communication with what the writer called the compressed time. The author claimed that certain locations in Ontario existed in multiple time frames simultaneously, and that radio waves could traverse these overlapping moments. The writer's name was signed at the bottom of each page, Petra Vosloo. The handwriting was identical to her own. She stumbled backward, her flashlight swinging wildly. That's when she saw the corner of the room, where the concrete walls met. Something was written there in what looked like dried blood. You will write these notes on May 7th, 2019. You cannot stop yourself. The frequency demands continuation. Petra ran. She crossed the field in blind panic, locked herself in the farmhouse, and tried to call the police. Her phone showed no signal. She tried her landline. Dead. She went to her car, thinking she'd drive to town, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Every system she tried had failed simultaneously. At 11:15 p.m., her radio equipment activated on its own. The speakers filled with that wet static, but now she could hear something else underneath it. Footsteps. Someone walking through her house, coming up the stairs, walking down the hallway toward her bedroom. She hid in her closet with a kitchen knife, listening to her bedroom door open. The footsteps approached the closet, stopped. And then a voice spoke, clear as day, right outside the closet door. Tomorrow you will understand. The frequency shows us what we become. The footsteps retreated. The house fell silent. Petra waited until dawn before emerging. She packed a single bag and walked the 2 miles to Gerald's farm, where she begged him to let her use his phone. Gerald listened to her story without expression, then said something that froze her blood. The woman who lived there before you, she looked just like you. Same face, same voice. She left on May 8th, 1987, left everything behind and never came back. Some folks in town, the old ones, they say she was the third one. Petra called a friend in Toronto, arranged a place to stay, and left that morning. She never went back to the farmhouse. But here's what she couldn't escape. Every May 6th, no matter where she is, at exactly 11:15 p.m., her phone receives a notification. It's a voice recording sent from her own number. And every year the recording is different. This year's message, received 3 weeks ago, said, "The fourth one arrives tomorrow. She looks so much like us." The farmhouse still stands empty. The for sale sign has been up for 4 years, but no one who views the property ever makes an offer. Petra still receives those recordings. She's stopped listening to them, but they keep coming. And sometimes, late at night, she catches herself writing in a notebook using phrases she doesn't remember learning. Phrases like, "the beneath soil remembers," and "counting the buried stones." She started having dreams about a barn, about stone steps, about a room full of radio equipment. And in these dreams, she's not walking down into the darkness. She's walking up, emerging into a May morning in a year she can't quite see. But she knows it's May 7th. It's always May 7th. Story 2. The Guelph Changeling. Marlo and Simone Thibault moved to Guelph in the summer of 2016, drawn by the city's reputation for good schools and safe neighborhoods. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Colette, who was, by all accounts, a normal, healthy child. She attended preschool at St. Patrick's, loved drawing pictures of horses, and had an imaginary friend she called Mr. Whistle, which the Thibaults found endlessly charming. Their house was a renovated Victorian on Wellington Street, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors. The previous owners had left behind some furniture, including an antique mirror, in the upstairs hallway that was too heavy to move easily. Simone mentioned wanting to replace it several times, but somehow they never got around to it. Colette's behavior changed in October. Right around Halloween, she became fixated on her reflection, spending long periods standing in the upstairs hallway, staring at herself in the antique mirror. When Simone asked what she was doing, Colette said she was talking to the other Colette. Simone assumed this was an extension of the imaginary friend phase and didn't think much of it. But then Colette began saying disturbing things at dinner. She asked why the other Colette didn't have to eat food. She asked if the other Colette could come live with them instead of her going to live in the mirror. When Marlowe suggested they play a game together, Colette said, "The other Colette says games are for children who don't know the truth yet." They took her to a child psychologist, Dr. Winona Blackstone, who specialized in developmental issues. After 3 sessions, Dr. Blackstone called them in for a consultation. She was visibly uncomfortable as she explained that Colette had said some things that concerned her. During their last session, when asked to draw her family, Colette had drawn 3 figures: a man, a woman, and 2 identical little girls standing on opposite sides of what appeared to be a doorway. When Dr. Blackstone asked who the girls were, Colette had said, "That's me and me. One is leaving, and one is staying." The doctor asked if there had been any discussion of divorce or major changes at home. The Thibaults said no. Their marriage was solid. Nothing had changed. Dr. Blackstone then showed them something else Colette had drawn. It was a detailed sketch of the antique mirror in their hallway, but in the reflection, the little girl's face was subtly wrong. The smile was too wide. The eyes were too dark. That night, Marlowe suggested they remove the mirror. But when they went upstairs, they found Colette standing in front of it, her palm pressed flat against the glass. She was crying. When Simone tried to pull her away, Colette screamed, "She's pulling me! She wants to trade!" They carried her to her bedroom and locked the hallway door. Marlowe called a friend with a truck, and they arranged to have the mirror removed the next day. That night, Simone couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. She assumed it was Marlowe checking on Colette, but when she reached over, he was asleep beside her. She got up and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the door they'd locked was standing open. She walked to Colette's room and found her daughter's bed empty. Panic seized her. She ran through the house, calling Colette's name. Marlowe woke and joined the search. They checked every room, every closet, the basement, the backyard. Nothing. Then Simone remembered the mirror. She ran upstairs and found Colette standing in front of it again. But something was different. The girl was facing away from the mirror, standing perfectly still, her head tilted at an odd angle. When Simone called her name, the child turned around slowly. Her face looked exactly like Colette's, but there was something subtly wrong about the way she moved. The smile came too quickly. The blink rate was off. When she spoke, her voice had a slight echo. "Mommy, I came back. The other Colette wanted to stay in there, but I didn't want to leave you." Simone picked her up, noting that she felt lighter somehow, and carried her back to bed. She told herself it was exhaustion, fear, imagination. But when she tucked Colette in, the child grabbed her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "It's so much quieter in there. The other Colette used to cry all the time. That's why I don't cry anymore." Over the following weeks, the Thibaults noticed more changes. Colette no longer drew pictures. She stopped playing with her toys. She ate mechanically, without enjoyment or complaint. She never cried, never laughed, never showed any strong emotion. When they asked about Mr. Whistle, she looked at them with blank confusion and said, "I don't know who that is. Did the other Colette talk about someone named that?" Her preschool teacher, Mrs. Gagnon, called them in for a meeting. She was concerned because Colette had stopped interacting with the other children. More disturbing, when Mrs. Gagnon had asked the children to participate in circle time, Colette had said, "The other Colette liked circles. I think they're meaningless shapes. Marlowe had the mirror removed in December. It took 4 men to carry it down the stairs. He paid a junk dealer to haul it away, not caring where it went. That night, they heard scratching sounds inside the walls. A sound like small fingernails scraping against the inside of the plaster. Colette appeared in their bedroom doorway. "She's angry that you took away her door. She's looking for another way to come. Back." Then she climbed into bed between them and fell asleep instantly, not moving at all for the entire night, not even seeming to breathe deeply enough for them to see her chest rise. They took her to specialists, neurologists, psychiatrists, anyone who might explain the change. Every test came back normal. Physically, she was perfectly healthy. Psychologically, the doctors struggled to find anything diagnostically significant. She wasn't autistic. She wasn't schizophrenic. She was just different in ways that medical science couldn't quite categorize. Simone began reviewing old family videos, watching footage of Colette from before October. The difference was stark. The old Colette had been vibrant, expressive, full of life. This Colette moved like she was learning how to be human by watching and imitating. One night in January, unable to sleep, Simone went to the upstairs hallway where the mirror had hung. There was still a dark rectangle on the wallpaper where it had been. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt it give slightly, as if the plaster was softer than it should be. Then she heard breathing on the other side of the wall. Shallow, quick breaths, like a small child crying silently. She ran to Colette's room. Her daughter was sitting up in bed, wide awake, staring at the wall. "She found a crack," Colette said calmly. "The other Colette found a crack between there and here. She's been crawling through the spaces inside the house." "What does she want?" Simone asked, her voice shaking. "She wants what I have. She wants to be the one who gets to live here. But I got here first this time." Colette smiled, and in the darkness of the room, her teeth seemed too numerous, as if her mouth contained more than it should. "Don't worry, Mommy. I'll keep her out. I'm stronger than she is now. I've been practicing being real." The Thibauts moved out of the house in March. They told friends and family that they'd found a better opportunity in Ottawa, but the truth was that they couldn't stay another night in that house. The sounds in the walls had gotten louder. Sometimes they saw small handprints appearing on the inside of windows, pressed against the glass from within. Colette is 7 now. She's learned to mimic emotions better. She laughs when other children laugh, cries when she gets hurt, shows excitement about birthday parties. But Simone watches her daughter and knows, with absolute certainty, that she's watching something wear her daughter's face. Something that learned how to be Colette by studying her through a mirror. The Victorian house on Wellington Street has been through 3 owners since the Thibauts left. Each family stayed less than a year. The current owners have reported nothing unusual, except that their young son insists there's a little girl living inside the walls who tells him secrets at night. Secrets about the spaces between rooms, where reflections go when you turn away from mirrors, and how easy it is to trade places if you want something badly enough. And sometimes, late at night, Simone still wakes up to find Colette standing at the foot of her bed, just watching her in the darkness. When she asks what's wrong, Colette always says the same thing. "I was just making sure you were real. The other Colette used to check too. I'm just remembering how she used to do it." Story 3. The Caledon Recording. In November of 2017, an audio engineering student named Booker Jansen was hiking through the forks of the Credit Provincial Park near Caledon when he decided to make some field recordings of the forest ambience. He was working on a project for his thesis at York University about natural soundscapes and wanted to capture the specific acoustic properties of the woods in late autumn. He set up his equipment near an old stone foundation, the remains of some structure that had long since crumbled away. His microphones were top quality, capable of capturing frequencies well beyond human hearing range. He started recording and walked a distance away to avoid contaminating the audio with his own sounds. When he reviewed the recording that evening, he found something unusual. At exactly the 7-minute mark, there was a voice. It was speaking English, but the voice had an odd quality, as if it was coming from underwater or through layers of fabric. He isolated the segment and ran it through enhancement software. The voice said, November 17th, 2017. 7 minutes after recording begins. Booker Jansen will hear this, and he will come back. Booker felt his skin crawl. That was today's date, and his name. He checked the metadata on the recording, looking for signs of corruption or interference. Everything was normal. He posted the audio clip to an online forum for audio engineers, asking if anyone could explain how a recording he'd made could contain his own name and the exact date. Most responses suggested it was a hoax, but one user, someone with the handle Sonic Archivist, sent him a private message. The message contained coordinates and a single line of text. You recorded something that was already there. Go back at the same time tomorrow. Bring more storage. Booker was skeptical, but curiosity overcame caution. The next day, November 18th, he returned to the Stone Foundation at the exact same time, 4:47 p.m. This time he brought his entire portable recording rig, with enough storage for 6 hours of uncompressed audio. He set up the equipment and started recording. Then he waited. The forest was silent, except for the wind moving through bare branches. As the light began to fade, he heard something that made his blood freeze. Voices. Multiple voices, all speaking at once, coming from the direction of the Stone Foundation. He couldn't see anyone, but the voices were clear. They were having conversations, fragments of dialogue that overlapped and intertwined. He heard a woman saying something about bringing water from the well, a man's voice discussing the harvest, children laughing. But there was something wrong with the sounds. They had no acoustic space around them, no echo, no environmental reflection. They sounded artificial, as if they were being played through invisible speakers. The voices continued for 11 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Booker approached the Stone Foundation carefully, but there was no one there. No speakers, no equipment, no people. He packed up his gear and drove directly to his apartment, barely breathing the entire way. The recording was crystal clear. 6 different voices, engaged in mundane conversations that seemed to be from a different era. He researched the location and discovered that the Stone Foundation had been part of a farmhouse built in 1847. The house had burned down in 1923, killing a family of 6. Parents Judith and Nathaniel Whitmore, and their 4 children. But that wasn't the disturbing part. As Booker listened to the recording repeatedly, he began to notice that the voices were acknowledging him. At one point, the woman's voice said clearly, "There's someone listening who shouldn't be listening. They're bringing machines to hear us." A child's voice responded, "Can they help us leave?" And then a man's voice, angry and sharp, "No one leaves. We tried leaving. It just brings us back to the moment." Booker enhanced every fragment of audio he could isolate. Slowly, a horrible narrative emerged. The family was trapped in the moment of their death, living the same day over and over. They were aware of it. They'd been aware of it for nearly 100 years. And somehow, Booker's recording equipment had intersected with whatever loop they were caught in. He received another message from Sonic Archivist. "You've made contact. Now they know someone can hear them. You have to keep recording. It's the only way to document what's happening to them." Against his better judgment, Booker returned to the location every evening for a week. Each time, the voices were there, and each time they became more insistent. They begged him to help them. They described their existence as an endless cycle of waking up, performing the same actions, experiencing the fire that killed them, and then waking up again at dawn. They said the stone foundation was the anchor point, the location where they were trapped. On November 24th, the voices told him something that made him stop recording. They said, "You've been coming here for 7 days. That means in our time, you've been here for almost 90 years. We can see all the yous every time you'll ever come here, all at once. And we can see when you stop coming. It's soon." "When do I stop?" Booker asked out loud, feeling foolish for speaking to ghosts. "Tonight? You stop tonight? Because tonight you become stuck with us." Booker packed up his equipment immediately. As he was leaving, he heard a new voice on his headphones, even though he'd already stopped recording. It was his own voice, saying, "November 24th, 2017. This is Booker Jansen. I'm trapped at the Stone Foundation. I've been trapped here for 3 hours, or 3 years, or 30 years. I can't tell anymore. If you can hear this, don't try to help. Just document that this happened." He ran. He drove back to Toronto and locked himself in his apartment. When he checked his recording equipment, the last file was corrupted, showing impossible metadata. The file properties said it had been created in 1923 and last modified in 2089. Booker dropped out of the audio engineering program. He sold all his equipment. He refused to discuss what he'd recorded with anyone, including his thesis advisor. But he couldn't escape what he'd experienced. Every night at exactly 4:47 p.m., he heard the voices. They weren't coming from any device or speaker. They were just there in the air around him, quiet but persistent. He started seeing a therapist, Dr. Ramona Kellner, who specialized in trauma. He told her everything. She listened without judgment and suggested he might be experiencing a form of auditory hallucination brought on by stress. She recommended medication. The medication didn't help. The voices continued. And they started saying new things. They told him about his future. They described events that hadn't happened yet with perfect accuracy. They told him he'd move to Vancouver in 6 months. He did. They told him he'd meet a woman named Sarah Duchon at a coffee shop on Robson Street. He did. They told him the relationship would last 14 months. It did, ending the exact week they'd predicted. 3 months ago, the voices told him he'd receive an email from someone claiming to be Sonic Archivist. They said the email would contain coordinates for a location in Sudbury, and that the email would say, "We need to document another one. This time, bring video equipment." Last week, Booker received that email. He hasn't responded. But every day, at 4:47 p.m., the voices tell him the same thing. "You'll go to Sudbury on January 9th. We can see you there. We can see you setting up cameras. We can see you becoming part of the documentation. It's already happened, Booker. We're just waiting for you to catch up to when you are." Booker Jansen still lives in Vancouver. He works as a bartender now, avoiding anything related to audio engineering. He's terrified of the date January 9th, which is coming soon. But the voices are insistent. They say time isn't linear for them anymore, and that anyone who records them becomes entangled in their loop. They say Booker has already made the choice to go to Sudbury, because from their perspective, it already happened. Last night he found a plane ticket to Sudbury on his kitchen table. He lives alone. He didn't buy the ticket. But it's in his name, dated for January 8th, arriving January 9th. The voices were laughing when he found it, and one voice, his own voice, said, "See you soon. We've been waiting for you to arrive for 70 years now." Story 4. The Port Hope Swimmers. Port Hope is a picturesque town on the shore of Lake Ontario, known for its well-preserved Victorian architecture and friendly community. But in the summer of 2018, something began appearing in the water that changed how the residents viewed their shoreline forever. It started with a report from a kayaker named Dexter Wolfgram, who was paddling about 200 meters from shore on a calm July morning. He later told police that he saw a group of swimmers in the water ahead of him, moving in a strange synchronization, diving and surfacing in perfect unison. He called out to them, wondering if they were part of a swim club or training team. They didn't respond. As he got closer, he noticed something disturbing. They weren't wearing wetsuits or swimming gear. They appeared to be dressed in regular clothes, heavy fabrics that should have dragged them down. And their movements, while synchronized, were wrong. They weren't swimming like humans swim. Their arms and legs moved in ways that seemed jointless, boneless, undulating through the water like eels. Dexter paddled closer, concerned that something was wrong, that perhaps these people needed help. When he was about 20 meters away, they all dove beneath the surface simultaneously. He waited for them to resurface. They didn't. He paddled over the area where they'd disappeared, looking down into the murky water. The lake was only about 4 meters deep in that spot, and he could see the sandy bottom clearly. There was no one there. He reported it to the harbor master, a man named Vic Trelawney, who'd worked the Port Hope waterfront for 30 years. Vic listened with a strange expression, then told Dexter something he'd never shared publicly before. In the summer of 1952, a passenger ferry called the Harmony had capsized during a sudden storm about 300 meters from shore. 43 people drowned. Most of the bodies were recovered, but 7 were never found. Every few years, Vic said, someone reports seeing swimmers in old-fashioned clothes, moving strange in the water. They're always in the same area where the Harmony went down. Most folks don't talk about it. Bad for tourism. Dexter might have dismissed this as local legend, except that 2 days later, a group of teenagers swimming from the public beach encountered the same swimmers. The teens, 3 boys named Marcus Levitt, Oscar Prendergast, and Jamal Quinn, were about 50 meters from shore when they saw people in the water nearby. They swam over, thinking it was other teenagers. But as they got closer, they realized these swimmers looked strange. They were wearing really old clothes, Marcus later told his parents, like dresses and suits, the kind you see in black and white photos. And they were floating vertically in the water, not treading water or anything, just standing upright like they were on solid ground. Oscar said the most disturbing part was their faces. They were waterlogged, bloated. Their eyes were white, like they had cataracts or something, and they all turned to look at us at the exact same moment. The boys swam back to shore as fast as they could. When they looked back from the beach, the strange swimmers were gone. More sightings followed throughout July and August. A sailing instructor named Fatima Chevalier reported seeing them surrounding her sailboat, just beneath the surface, their faces pressed up against the hull. A fishing charter captain named Donald Brewster said they appeared alongside his boat one foggy morning, keeping pace with his vessel for nearly a kilometer before sinking out of sight. The town council tried to keep it quiet, but by late August, the story had spread. Tourism dropped. The public beach saw attendance fall by 60%. Local news picked up the story, interviewing witnesses who all described the same thing. Swimmers in old-fashioned clothing, moving in impossible ways, appearing and disappearing in the waters off Port Hope. Then, in early September, something worse happened. A woman named Ingrid Morozov decided to investigate. She was a recreational diver and amateur historian who'd become fascinated by the Harmony disaster. She wanted to see if there was any debris from the wreck still visible on the lake bottom. She went out on a calm Tuesday morning with full diving gear, accompanied by her friend Yasmin Trudeau, who stayed in the boat. Ingrid descended to the bottom in the area where the Harmony had supposedly capsized. The visibility was poor, only a few meters, and the bottom was mostly sand and rocks. She was down there for about 10 minutes when she saw them. 7 figures, standing in a circle on the lake bottom, holding hands. They were wearing clothes from the 1950s, now rotted and covered in algae. They weren't moving, just standing there in perfect formation. Ingrid checked her air and decided to surface immediately. As she ascended, the figures began moving. They didn't swim upward. They walked, striding across the lake bottom in her direction, their movements fluid despite being underwater. She kicked harder, ascending as fast as she safely could, watching her dive computer to avoid the bends. She broke the surface and swam frantically to the boat. Yasmin hauled her up, asking what was wrong. Ingrid was hyperventilating, barely able to speak. She pointed at the water and managed to say, "They're coming up." Yasmin started the motor and accelerated away from the area. Ingrid watched the water behind them. 7 figures surfaced, standing vertically in the water, their heads and shoulders visible above the waves. They weren't bobbing or moving with the current. They simply stood there, impossibly upright, watching the boat leave. Ingrid reviewed her dive camera footage that evening. Most of it was too murky to see much, but there was one clear shot of the 7 figures standing in their circle. And in the enhanced version of the image, you could see their faces. They were looking directly at the camera. Their mouths were open, as if screaming, but no bubbles emerged. Their eyes were completely white. She took the footage to the police, then to a marine biologist at Queen's University named Dr. Henrik Sorensen. Dr. Sorensen examined the footage and said, from a scientific standpoint, what she'd captured was impossible. Human bodies don't stand upright underwater at that depth. The neutral buoyancy point for a human is near the surface. These figures should have either floated up or sunk to the bottom in a horizontal position. "Whatever these are," he said, "they're not following the physics of drowned bodies." The sightings stopped in October when the water got too cold for swimming. But they resumed the following summer, and the summer after that. The pattern is consistent now. From July through September, the Port Hope swimmers appear in the waters where the Harmony went down. They don't interact with living people directly, but they watch. They follow boats. They surface near swimmers. Local historians discovered something disturbing in the archives. Of the 43 confirmed deaths in the Harmony disaster, 36 bodies were recovered and buried. 7 were never found. Their names were listed in a memorial plaque near the harbor. Catherine Whitford, age 29, James Murdoch, age 43, Sarah and Emma Torrance, ages 17 and 19, Robert Kinsella, age 34, Dorothy Ashford, age 52, and a 7-year-old boy named Thomas Pemberton. 7 lost swimmers. 7 figures appearing in the water every summer. This past July, something new happened. A young woman named Chelsea Beaumont was swimming alone early one morning when she encountered them. Unlike other witnesses, she didn't immediately swim away. She later told investigators that she felt compelled to stay, as if something was pulling her toward them. One of the figures, a woman in a waterlogged dress, approached her. Chelsea said the woman's lips moved, and even though they were underwater and no sound should have carried, she heard a voice clearly. "We've been waiting so long. The water holds us here. We can't get to shore. We try every summer, but we always end up back where we drowned." Chelsea asked, "What do you need?" The woman's white eyes seemed to focus on her. "Remember us. Say our names on the shore. Maybe if we're remembered on land, we can stop trying to get there." Chelsea swam back to the beach and immediately looked up the memorial plaque. She read all 7 names aloud, standing at the water's edge. As she spoke the last name, Thomas Pemberton, she heard a sound like a collective exhalation, a breath released from 7 sets of lungs. The swimmers haven't been seen since then. It's been 4 months now, well past when they would normally disappear for the winter. Some people think Chelsea broke whatever curse held them. Others think they're just waiting, building strength for a more dramatic appearance next summer. But Chelsea knows something no one else does. When she swam back to shore that morning, she turned around once to look at the swimmers. They were standing in a line, watching her go. And at the end of the line, there was an eighth figure. A figure that looked exactly like her, wearing the same swimsuit she had on, with the same waterlogged appearance as the others. She hasn't gone back in the water since. And next summer, when someone inevitably reports seeing swimmers in old-fashioned clothes moving, strangely in the waters off Port Hope, she wonders if there will be 8 figures instead of 7. And if one of them will be wearing a blue swimsuit, the exact one she wore that morning, forever trying to reach a shore it will never touch. Story 5. The Parry Sound Broadcast. In October 2015, residents of Parry Sound began experiencing strange interference on their televisions and radios. At first, it seemed like typical signal problems, but the interference had an unusual pattern. Every night at 2:47 a.m., all broadcasts would cut out for exactly 90 seconds, replaced by static. A telecommunications technician named Valentina Cortez was called in to investigate. She spent 3 nights monitoring the signal patterns from the local broadcast tower, trying to identify the source of the interference. On the 3rd night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the static appeared on her equipment as expected. But this time, something was embedded in it. She recorded the signal and ran it through a spectral analysis program. Hidden in the static was an audio message, heavily compressed and distorted. It took her 6 hours of processing to clean it up enough to be intelligible. But when she finally isolated it, she heard something that made her question her sanity. It was an emergency broadcast message. A voice, calm and professional, speaking in the cadence of a news announcer. This is an emergency alert for the Parry Sound region. A mandatory evacuation order is in effect. Residents must leave the area immediately. Proceed north on Highway 400. Do not go near the water. This is not a drill. November 2nd, 2015. This is not a drill. Valentina checked the date. It was October 19th. November 2nd was still 2 weeks away. She reported her findings to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a prank or some kind of signal bleed from a test broadcast. But Valentina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She made copies of the recording and sent them to colleagues, asking for their analysis. One colleague, a signal processing expert named Dr. Raymond Pelletier, examined the recording and found something disturbing. The broadcast contained metadata that indicated it had been transmitted from the future. The timestamp embedded in the digital signal showed November 2nd, 2015, at 2:47 a.m. It's impossible, Raymond told her over the phone. Timestamps can be faked, but the signal degradation pattern is consistent with a broadcast that's been looping for exactly 14 days. It's as if the signal from November 2nd is somehow reaching backward through time, appearing earlier each night. Valentina began monitoring the broadcast every night. The pattern held. Each night, the same message appeared, but the audio quality improved slightly, as if the signal was getting stronger as it approached the date in the message. By October 28th, the message was clear enough that she could hear background sounds, sirens, screaming, and something else, a deep rumbling sound that reminded her of thunder, but sustained and growing louder. She tried to contact local emergency services to warn them about the broadcast, but no one took her seriously. She tried media outlets, but they treated it as a curiosity, not a threat. She was running out of time. On November 1st, the night before the date in the broadcast, Valentina packed her car with essentials and tried to convince her neighbors to leave. Most thought she was overreacting. A few, disturbed by her intensity, agreed to stay with relatives out of town just to humor her. She drove north on Highway 400 that evening, finding a motel in Sudbury. She didn't sleep. At 2:47 a.m., she turned on the television. The emergency broadcast appeared, but now it was accompanied by video. Shaky footage, clearly taken from a phone or camera, showed the town of Parry Sound at night. The water of Georgian Bay was wrong. It was glowing, a sickly green phosphorescence, and it was rising. Not like a flood or a tide, but rising impossibly fast, climbing up over the docks, into the streets, defying gravity as it crept up buildings. The video showed people running, trying to get to their cars. But the water was moving faster. And in the water, there were shapes. Large shapes moving beneath the glowing surface, shadows that suggested something massive and alive. The broadcast cut to black. When the regular programming resumed, Valentina sat in frozen silence. She waited for news reports, for confirmation that something terrible had happened in Parry Sound. Nothing came. Morning arrived. She checked every news source she could find. Everything was normal. Parry Sound was fine. No evacuation, no emergency, no glowing water. She drove back to Parry Sound that afternoon, expecting to find the town evacuated or damaged. Instead, everything was perfectly normal. People were going about their daily business. The bay looked peaceful and ordinary. She asked people if anything unusual had happened the night before. Everyone looked at her like she was crazy. She showed them the recording she'd made of the broadcast. They watched it, disturbed, but insisted nothing like that had occurred. Valentina tried to return to work, but she couldn't concentrate. The broadcast had been so specific, so detailed. She knew what she'd seen. She began investigating the history of Parry Sound, looking for anything that might explain the broadcast. She discovered something in old records at the local library. In 1952, there had been an unusual algae bloom in Georgian Bay that produced bioluminescent water. Scientists at the time couldn't explain it, and it disappeared after 3 days. But there were reports, mostly dismissed as hysteria, of fishermen seeing large shapes moving beneath the glowing water. One fisherman, a man named Thomas Brockwell, had insisted that something in the water was intelligent. He claimed he saw what looked like structures on the lake bottom during the bloom, geometric formations that couldn't be natural. He tried to dive down to investigate, but was stopped by other fishermen who feared the water was toxic. Brockwell died in 1954, but his grandson, Leonard Brockwell, still lived in Parry Sound. Valentina tracked him down and asked if he knew anything about his grandfather's claims. Leonard, now in his 70s, invited her to his house and showed her boxes of his grandfather's papers. The papers contained detailed drawings of what Thomas had seen. Underwater structures that looked almost like buildings, but with proportions and angles that made no architectural sense. He'd written extensively about his belief that something lived beneath Georgian Bay, something that predated human settlement, something that occasionally tried to communicate or manifest. "My grandfather became obsessed," Leonard said. "He spent the last 2 years of his life trying to convince people that humanity needed to be careful with the bay. He said there were cycles, times when the boundary between the water and whatever was beneath it became thin. He predicted it would happen again in 2015. Valentina felt her skin crawl. November 2nd, 2015? Leonard looked at her with surprise. "How did you know?" That's the exact date he calculated. He said it would be the centennial of some event he'd discovered in old indigenous records. He said that was when the water would glow again, and when they would try to come through. "But nothing happened," Valentina said. "I was ready for it. I evacuated. But nothing happened." Leonard smiled sadly. "Maybe that's because you were ready for it. My grandfather's notes said that awareness was important. He believed these entities, whatever they are, feed on ignorance. If enough people are unaware and unprepared, they can breach. But if people are ready, if they evacuate or take precautions, the breach fails." Valentina didn't know what to believe. She still doesn't. But she kept monitoring the broadcasts. For weeks after November 2nd, the nightly interference continued, but now it showed different footage, alternate versions of November 2nd. In some, Parry Sound was flooded. In others, the water was calm, but the town was empty, as if everyone had simply vanished. In one particularly disturbing version, the footage showed downtown Parry Sound transformed, with buildings covered in some kind of organic growth that looked both plant-like and crystalline, and the streets full of things that moved like humans, but were clearly not. The broadcasts stopped in December 2015, but they resumed in October 2018, this time showing a date of November 2nd, 2018. Valentina evacuated again. Again, nothing happened in the physical world, but the broadcast showed catastrophe in alternate versions. The pattern repeats every 3 years. October 2021 saw the broadcasts return. October 2024, they appeared again. And they're scheduled to return this October in 2027. Valentina has dedicated her life to monitoring these broadcasts. She's compiled hundreds of hours of footage showing alternate versions of Parry Sound, different outcomes of what happens when November 2nd arrives. She's tried to warn authorities, but her warnings are dismissed. The fact that nothing has happened in the physical timeline makes people think she's paranoid or mentally ill, but she knows the truth. Every 3 years, on November 2nd, something tries to happen in Parry Sound. The broadcasts are echoes from timelines where it succeeds. And each time, the alternate versions show the entities from beneath Georgian Bay, getting closer to breaking through in the timeline we inhabit. In the 2024 broadcasts, the footage showed something new. The glowing water reached farther inland than ever before, and in several versions, there were humans in the footage who weren't running away. They were walking into the water voluntarily, their expressions blank and peaceful, joining whatever waited beneath the surface. Valentina recognized one of them. It was her. In that alternate November 2024, instead of evacuating, she'd walked down to the bay and let the glowing water close over her head. She's terrified that one year she won't evacuate, that whatever is beneath Georgian Bay will find a way to reach her, to convince her to join it. She's seen herself doing it in a dozen different timeline versions now. In each one, she looks happy as she disappears beneath the glowing surface. November 2nd, 2027 is coming. The broadcasts will start appearing in October, and Valentina doesn't know if this will be the year when she doesn't evacuate. When what she's seen in those broadcasts becomes her reality instead of just another alternate version. She keeps Thomas Brockwell's drawings in her apartment. She looks at those impossible underwater structures and wonders if they're still there, waiting beneath Georgian Bay, waiting for the right November 2nd, when awareness fails, when enough people are unprepared, when the boundary finally collapses completely. And she wonders if, in some alternate timeline, she's already there, living in those geometric structures that make no sense, breathing water instead of air, part of whatever waits beneath the bay, looking up through the dark water at a world she used to inhabit, sending broadcasts backward through time, trying to warn herself to stay away, or trying to lure herself in. She doesn't know which anymore. Story 6. The Coburg Procession. Coburg is a quiet lakeside town that prides itself on its normalcy and charm. But between June 14th and June 21st, 2020, something happened that no resident has been able to adequately explain and most prefer not to discuss. It started with a phone call to police from a woman named Tessa Gunderson, who lived on King Street. She reported that a group of people was walking past her house in complete silence at 3:33 a.m. Not jogging, not running, just walking in a single file line down the middle of the street. She said there were at least 30 people, all wearing white clothing, moving with mechanical precision. The police sent a patrol car to investigate, but by the time officers arrived, the street was empty. They checked with Tessa, who insisted she'd watched them walk past for nearly 10 minutes. She'd even taken a photo from her window. But when she tried to show officers, the image file was corrupted, showing only distorted pixels. The next night, June 15th, 7 different residents called in similar reports. A procession of people in white, walking silently through different neighborhoods, always at exactly 3:33 a.m. As I see, man named Horace Menzies tried to approach them, calling out from his front porch. The procession didn't acknowledge him. He described their faces as empty, saying their expressions were completely neutral, and none of them blinked or turned their heads. On June 16th, the procession was larger. Witnesses estimated over 100 people. They walked down Division Street, heading toward the lakeshore. A teenager named Sienna Barclay recorded a video from her bedroom window. The footage shows the procession clearly. People of all ages, wearing white clothing that looked handmade and old-fashioned, walking in perfect synchronization. What made the footage disturbing was what happened when Sienna's phone camera focused on individual faces. The autofocus couldn't lock onto them. It kept searching, adjusting, as if the faces weren't properly three-dimensional. And in several frames, when the camera did focus, the faces appeared blurred in a way that didn't match the motion or the lighting, deliberately blurred, as if something was preventing clear documentation of their features. By June 17th, the town was on alert. Police organized patrols, determined to intercept and identify the procession. Local news covered the story, suggesting it might be an organized prank or a viral marketing stunt. But when 3:33 a.m. arrived, the procession appeared as expected, and something went wrong. The police attempted to block the procession at the intersection of Division and Spring Streets. 4 officers stood in the middle of the road with their cruisers' lights flashing, ordering the procession to stop. The people in white didn't slow down. They walked directly toward the officers. The officers reported that as the procession got closer, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. One officer, Constable Devin Krupinski, said it felt like walking into a room where someone had just died. The air temperature dropped noticeably, their radios filled with static. And when the first people, in white, reached the cruisers, they simply walked through them. Not around them, through them, passing through solid matter as if it wasn't there. The officers scrambled backward, watching the procession continue down Division Street, passing through cars, mailboxes, and fences without slowing or diverting. One officer tried to grab someone in the procession, and his hand went through the figure's shoulder. He described it as feeling like touching extremely cold smoke. The procession walked to the lakeshore and continued walking into the water. They didn't swim or float. They walked, their bodies sinking beneath the surface in single file, disappearing into Lake Ontario. By June 18th, the story had gone national. News crews descended on Cobourg, setting up cameras along the likely route. Paranormal investigators arrived with equipment. Skeptics organized counter-demonstrations, insisting it was mass hysteria or an elaborate hoax. But at 3:33 a.m., the procession appeared again, even larger now. An estimated 300 people in white, walking with that same mechanical precision. The news cameras captured everything. The footage was broadcast live. Millions watched as the procession walked directly through parked cars, past police barriers, and into Lake Ontario. A marine unit was standing by in boats. As the procession entered the water, the officers tried to reach the figures, to pull them out. But their hands passed through empty water. The figures weren't physically there, at least not in a way that could be touched or stopped. One diver, a woman named Corporal Anita Rougeau, decided to follow them underwater. She descended, keeping her dive light trained on the procession as they walked along the lake bottom. Her helmet camera captured the footage. The figures walked in perfect formation across the sandy bottom. They showed no sign of buoyancy or current resistance. They simply walked, deeper and deeper, until they reached a depression in the lake floor. And there, the camera showed something impossible. A door. Standing upright on the lake bottom, set in a frame of worked stone that looked ancient. The door was closed, made of dark wood bound with iron. The procession stopped in front of it. For the first time, they broke their single-file line, forming a semicircle facing the door. Then, in unison, they all raised their right hands and knocked on the door. 3 times. The sound shouldn't have been audible underwater, but Corporal Rougeau's camera microphone picked it up clearly. 3 hollow knocks that echoed across the lake bottom. The door didn't open. After the 3rd knock, the figures turned and began walking back toward shore. Corporal Rougeau ascended quickly, disturbed by what she'd witnessed. When she surfaced and checked her depth gauge, she realized she'd descended to 53 meters, well beyond the safe limit for her equipment. She should have been experiencing nitrogen narcosis, but she felt completely clear-headed. The procession emerged from the water, walking back onto the beach. But this time, something was different. The figures were looking at the crowds of onlookers and news cameras. Their heads turned, tracking individual people. Their mouths opened, as if they wanted to speak, but no sound emerged. Then they continued their walk back through town, following their route in reverse, passing through obstacles until they disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. June 19th brought an even larger procession. Over 500 people. And this time they did something new. When they reached certain houses, they stopped. They stood in front yards, facing specific homes, just standing silently for 5 minutes before continuing their route. Researchers later determined that all 14 houses where the procession stopped had something in common. Someone had died in those homes within the past 70 years. Not violent deaths or unusual circumstances, just normal deaths. But the procession seemed to mark these locations, acknowledging them in some way. On June 20th, the procession numbered over 1,000. They filled entire streets, a river of white-clothed figures walking with that same mechanical precision. This time, when they reached the lake and walked into the water, dozens of divers followed them. The footage from multiple cameras showed the same impossible scene. The procession walked to the door on the lake bottom. This time, one figure stepped forward. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, wearing a white dress that looked like a wedding gown. She placed her hand on the door and pushed. It opened. Beyond the door, the cameras showed something that shouldn't exist. A hallway, carved from stone, stretching away into illuminated distance. The light came from no visible source, just a general glow that made the stone look wet. The procession began filing through the door, entering the hallway, disappearing from view. The young woman in the wedding dress stood by the door, waiting. She was looking up at the divers, her face finally clear in the camera light. She was smiling. A sad smile, full of longing. She mouthed words, and lip readers later determined she was saying, "Soon, you'll all come through soon." Then she followed the procession through the door, and it closed behind her. The divers swam down to examine the door. It was solid, real, made of actual wood and iron. But it wouldn't open. They tried forcing it, cutting it, even attempting to remove the stone frame. Nothing worked. The door sat there on the lake bottom, 43 meters down, impossible and immovable. June 21st was the final night. The procession appeared at 3:33 a.m. as expected, but this time they brought someone new. A living person, a resident of Cobourg, walking with them. Her name was Eleanor Ritchie, an 87-year-old woman who'd been suffering from late-stage dementia. Her family reported her missing from her care facility at approximately 3:15 a.m. Security footage showed her walking out the front door, still in her nightgown, following a group of people in white who'd appeared in the facility's corridors. The procession walked to the lake with Eleanor in their midst. She looked peaceful, happy even, holding hands with two of the white-clothed figures. Police and paramedics tried to intercept her, to bring her back, but every time someone got close, the figures in white would crowd around her protectively, and the rescuers' hands would pass through empty air. Eleanor walked into the water with the procession. This time, a dozen police divers went in immediately, determined to save her. But underwater, Eleanor was no longer visible to them. The procession walked to the door, and this time it was already open. They filed through, hundreds of figures entering that impossible hallway. The divers searched frantically for Eleanor, but she was gone. The door closed with the last figure, and the lake bottom was empty except for that sealed doorway. Eleanor Ritchie's body was never recovered. She's listed as a missing person, presumed drowned, though no physical evidence of her death has ever been found. The procession hasn't appeared since June 21st, 2020. The door remains on the lake bottom, a forbidden dive site now, monitored by authorities who don't want anyone attempting to open it. Multiple investigations have tried to explain what happened, but no rational explanation fits the evidence. Some residents believe the procession was a mass hallucination, induced by stress from the early pandemic period. Others think it was an elaborate hoax using projection technology and staged footage. But those theories don't explain Eleanor Ritchie's disappearance. They don't explain the door that still sits on the lake bottom, real and solid and locked. Local historians discovered something in old records. In June 1820, a sailing vessel called the White Lady disappeared in Lake Ontario near Cobourg during a storm. It was carrying 243 passengers, mostly immigrants from England, traveling to York. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies recovered. The passenger manifest listed the travelers' names. 243 people. Researchers comparing the manifest to the footage of the procession made a disturbing discovery. In the clearest footage, where faces were partially visible despite the blur effect, they found matches. Facial recognition software, used by a private investigator named Craig Desjardins, identified 17 people in the procession whose features matched portraits and descriptions of passengers from the White Lady's manifest. 243 passengers lost in 1820. A procession that grew each night, reaching over 1,000 by June 20. The numbers don't match perfectly, but the implication is clear. The procession was collecting something, or someone, adding to its numbers over 8 nights, preparing for something. And Eleanor Ritchie, whatever became of her, is now part of that collection. Walking somewhere beyond a door at the bottom of Lake Ontario, in a hallway that shouldn't exist, lit by impossible light, heading toward a destination that the living aren't meant to see. Unless you're chosen. Unless, like Eleanor, you hear them calling one night at 3:33 a.m., and you feel compelled to follow. To put on white clothes, or to simply walk as you are, joining that silent procession that walks through walls and closed doors, through solid matter and rational explanation, toward water that you'll walk into without fear, because you finally understand where you're supposed to go. The door waits. It's always waiting. And every June, some residents of Cobourg wake at 3:33 a.m. with an inexplicable urge to walk toward the lake. Most ignore it. Most go back to sleep. But a few stand at their windows, looking out at empty streets, wondering if tonight the procession will return, wondering if this time they'll join it. Story 7. The Huntsville Composite. In September 2019, a photography student named Dallas Ingram was working on a project documenting abandoned buildings in the Muskoka region. he came across an old psychiatric facility outside Huntsville that had been closed since 1987. The buildings were scheduled for demolition, but Dallas obtained permission from the property owner to photograph the interiors before they were destroyed. The facility was called Muskoka Pines Treatment Center, and it had housed roughly 200 patients at its peak. It closed after allegations of abuse and experimental treatments came to light, though no criminal charges were ever filed. The property had sat empty for 32 years, slowly deteriorating. Dallas spent 3 days photographing the buildings. The usual decay was present: peeling paint, broken windows, trees growing through floors. But he noticed something unusual in several rooms: photographs. Not just any photographs, but portraits, hundreds of them, covering entire walls in some rooms. They appeared to be patient photos, formal portraits like the kind taken for identification records. But they'd been arranged in strange patterns, overlapping and interconnected, as if someone was trying to create a composite image from multiple faces. He photographed these walls extensively, fascinated by the obsessive quality of the arrangement. Some walls contained 50 or 60 portraits, all positioned so that eyes lined up horizontally, creating a cascading effect of staring faces. When Dallas developed his photos back at his studio in Toronto, he noticed something he'd missed while shooting. In several images, there were additional faces that appeared to be part of the wall of portraits. But when he looked carefully, they weren't photographs at all. They were appearing in the actual walls, as if the concrete itself was producing facial features. Eyes, noses, mouths, all slightly raised from the surface like bas-relief sculptures, but clearly not intentional architectural elements. He thought it might be pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But the faces were too detailed, too consistent across multiple photographs from different angles. And more disturbing, when he compared photos taken on different days, the faces had moved. Not much, just slight changes in position, as if they were slowly migrating across the walls. Dallas returned to the facility 2 weeks later with video equipment, determined to document whatever was happening. He set up time-lapse cameras in 3 rooms, where the effect was strongest. He ran the cameras for 48 hours straight, checking the footage periodically. The time-lapse revealed something impossible. The faces in the walls were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they were rearranging themselves, forming new patterns, and they seemed to be multiplying. Where there had been 20 faces visible on one wall, now there were 35. Dallas also noticed that the portrait photographs were changing. The patients in the photos were posed differently in new shots, even though they were supposedly decades-old pictures. In one comparison, a patient who'd been facing forward in his first photos was now in profile. In another, a woman's expression had changed from neutral to smiling. He contacted a paranormal investigation team led by a woman named Dr. Yolanda Fairweather, who specialized in location-based phenomena. Dr. Fairweather brought a team of 6 investigators to the facility, equipped with thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and high-resolution photography equipment. They documented the facility for 5 nights. On the second night, one of the investigators, a man named Paxton Drury, complained of headaches and visual disturbances. He said the faces in the walls were talking to him, though not with sound. He described it as receiving messages directly in his mind, asking him to join the pattern. By the third night, Paxton was refusing to enter certain rooms. He said the faces were trying to pull him into the walls, that he could feel them tugging at his consciousness, trying to integrate him into whatever collective existence they represented. Dr. Fairweather decided to end the investigation early, but before they could leave, something happened to their equipment. Every camera, every recording device, every battery pack simultaneously failed. They were left in the facility after dark, with no light except their phone flashlights, which were rapidly draining. As they tried to evacuate the building, they discovered that the layout had changed. Hallways led to rooms that didn't match the building's blueprints. Doors opened into spaces that seemed too large to fit within the structure. And everywhere the walls were covered with faces now, not just in specific rooms but throughout the entire facility. Thousands of faces, all staring, all moving slowly. Paxton Drury separated from the group. He later claimed he didn't intentionally wander off, but that he was drawn to a specific room by an overwhelming compulsion. When the team found him 15 minutes later, he was standing in front of a wall covered in portraits, his hand pressed against it. His face had gone slack, expressionless, and when they pulled him away, they saw something that made them run from the facility immediately. On the wall where Paxton had been standing, a new photograph had appeared. A Polaroid-style image, still developing, showing Paxton's face in the same formal portrait style as the other pictures. But Paxton was standing right there with them. He was alive and present. Yet his photograph was now part of the wall pattern. They dragged him out of the facility and drove directly to the nearest hospital. Paxton seemed physically fine, but he was mentally altered. He spoke in a monotone, answering questions with minimal responses. When doctors asked him how he felt, he said, "I feel distributed. Part of me is still in the pattern." Dr. Fairweather confiscated Dallas's original photographs and banned him from publishing any images from the facility. She claimed that the photographs themselves were somehow contagious, that viewing them put people at risk of connection to whatever was happening in that building. But Dallas had already posted several images to his online portfolio. Within 2 weeks, he started receiving messages from people who'd seen his photos. They reported dreaming about the facility, seeing faces in the walls of their own homes, and feeling compelled to visit Huntsville. 3 people actually made the trip. A woman from Ottawa named Pearl Strachan, a man from Thunder Bay named Gordon Yee, and a teenager from Barrie named Michael Kopp. They didn't know each other, hadn't coordinated their trips, but they all arrived at the Muskoka Pines facility on the same night, October 31st, 2019. Security cameras at a nearby gas station captured all 3 vehicles arriving within an hour of each other. The 3 visitors were never seen leaving. Their cars were found parked outside the facility the next morning. Inside the building, investigators found no trace of them. No blood, no signs of struggle, no bodies. But in one of the rooms, on a wall that had been empty in previous documentation, there were 3 new portrait photographs. Pearl Strachan, Gordon Yee, and Michael Kopp, all staring at the camera with neutral expressions, part of the ever-growing pattern. The facility was demolished in November 2019, ahead of schedule, with minimal public explanation. The demolition crews reported unusual difficulties. Equipment kept malfunctioning. Workers complained of seeing faces in the walls even as the walls were being torn down. Several crew members quit, saying they felt like they were destroying something alive. One demolition worker, a foreman named Reg Trottier, saved a section of concrete wall that had particularly clear facial features. He took it home, planning to show it to his family as a curiosity. 3 days later, his wife called police, reporting that Reg was standing in their basement, facing the concrete fragment, completely unresponsive. When officers arrived, they found him in a catatonic state, his hand pressed against the concrete. At the hospital, Reg recovered enough to speak. But what he said was chilling. They're not gone. The building was just the strongest connection point. They're in the ground now, in the concrete fragments, in the photographs, in the memories of everyone who saw those walls. The pattern is still growing. It just needed us to document it, to spread it, so it could find new places to manifest. Reg Trottier was admitted to psychiatric care. He remains in treatment, insisting that he can still feel the pattern calling to him, trying to complete itself through him. Dallas Ingram deleted all his photographs from the facility, but it was too late. They'd been copied, shared, reposted across dozens of websites, and people who view them report similar experiences. Dreams of the facility, faces appearing in unexpected places, a growing compulsion to visit Huntsville. The property where Muskoka Pines stood is now an empty lot. The owner abandoned plans to develop it. But people still visit. Not tourists or history enthusiasts, but individuals who've seen the photographs, who feel drawn to the location without understanding why. They describe standing on the empty ground, feeling something beneath them, something vast and patient. They say if you stand there quietly at night, you can hear whispers rising from the earth. Hundreds of voices speaking in unison, saying the same thing over and over. The pattern needs completion. Add yourself to us. We're waiting for our faces to be seen. Local authorities have installed fencing and no trespassing signs, but they're regularly bypassed. Every few months, someone is found on the property, standing motionless, staring at the ground, their hand pressed flat against the earth. Most are rescued before anything worse happens. But some resist rescue. They fight, insisting they need to stay, that they're part of something important now. And later, if you look carefully at photographs taken at the site, you can see them. Faint impressions in the dirt, arrangements of stones and debris that, from certain angles, resolve into human faces. Hundreds of faces, forming a pattern that grows larger each year. The pattern that began in Muskoka Pines Treatment Center, that consumed Pearl and Gordon and Michael and Paxton, that reached out through photographs and pulled people into its composite structure. A pattern that's no longer contained by walls or buildings, but exists now in the shared consciousness of everyone who's seen those images, and Dallas Ingram, who started all this by taking photographs of abandoned rooms, reports that he's starting to see his own face appearing in mirrors in a way that doesn't quite match his movements. A slight delay, or a subtle difference in expression, as if the reflection is becoming independent, developing its own pattern, preparing to complete whatever the faces in the walls started. He's stopped looking in mirrors now, but that won't save him. Because the pattern doesn't need permission, it just needs to be seen. And once you've seen it, once you've acknowledged its existence, it has a way of finding you, of pulling you in, of adding your face to the composite, whether you're willing or not. The pattern grows, it's always growing, and somewhere in the ground beneath where Muskoka Pines once stood, beneath layers of demolished concrete and covered earth, thousands of faces are waiting, waiting to be complete, waiting for the next person to look at the photographs, to feel that compulsion, to make the trip to Huntsville, waiting to add one more face to the pattern that never ends. Story 8. The Kapuskasing Frequency Drift. In winter 2021, residents of Kapuskasing, a small mining and forestry town in northeastern Ontario, began reporting strange auditory phenomena. People described hearing voices in their homes that seemed to come from nowhere, conversations that faded in and out like poorly tuned radio signals. A telecommunications engineer named Tiago Brenner, who worked for a cellular network provider, was called in to investigate reports of interference. Multiple residents complained that their phones were picking up fragments of conversations, voices speaking on their devices even when no call was active. Tiago set up monitoring equipment throughout the town, trying to identify the source of the interference. What he discovered was unprecedented. There was an electromagnetic frequency permeating the entire Kapuskasing area, oscillating between 1420 and 1430 megahertz. This is known as the hydrogen line, a frequency naturally emitted by neutral hydrogen atoms in space. It's commonly used in radio astronomy. But this signal wasn't coming from space. It was emanating from beneath the ground. Tiago traced the signal to its strongest point, an abandoned mine shaft 3 kilometers outside of town. The Spruce Ridge mine had been closed since 1978, following a collapse that killed 11 miners. The shaft had been sealed, but Tiago's equipment showed the signal was definitely originating from below the sealed entrance. He contacted geological surveyors and mining experts, trying to find a rational explanation. One geologist, Dr. Sasha Melnick, suggested that certain mineral deposits could theoretically produce electromagnetic fields under specific conditions, though nothing that would match the frequency and strength of what Tiago was measuring. Against official advice, Tiago organized a small team to investigate the sealed mine. They included Dr. Melnick, a structural engineer named Felipe Ouellet, who specialized in mine safety, and 2 others, a journalist named Imani Carver, who'd been covering the story, and a local historian named Wallace Pritchard, who had extensive knowledge of the mine's history. They broke through the seal on February 12, 2021, at approximately 10 a.m. The shaft descended at a 30-degree angle, supported by rotting wooden beams. The group carried radio equipment, measuring devices, and extensive safety gear. The signal, strength increased dramatically as they descended. But more disturbing were the voices. They could hear them clearly now, without any electronic equipment. Conversations in English, fragments of sentences, overlapping and echoing through the tunnel. The voices had a hollow quality, as if filtered through layers of rock. They found the first body at approximately 100 meters down. It was one of the miners who'd died in the 1978 collapse, still wearing his work clothes, perfectly preserved in the cold, dry air. But something was wrong. The body was positioned as if sitting casually against the tunnel wall, not buried under rubble. And beside him, scratched into the rock wall, were hundreds of tally marks. Wallace counted them. 365 marks, grouped into sets of 7. "A year," he said quietly. He was counting days for a year. The voices grew louder as they continued. Now they could distinguish individual speakers. A man discussing the day's work quota. A woman asking about dinner plans. A child laughing. But the conversations made no linear sense. They were fragments, shuffled and repeated, creating an almost musical pattern. They found 6 more bodies before reaching the main collapse site. All positioned deliberately, not buried. All with tally marks scratched into the walls nearby. The final miner had stopped counting at 4,191 marks. More than 11 years of tally marks, though the mine had been sealed for 43 years. At the collapse site, they found something impossible. The tunnel continued beyond where it should have ended. The maps showed the collapse had sealed this section completely, but there was a passage, roughly 2 meters wide, that continued deeper into the earth. The rock walls around the passage were smooth, almost melted-looking, as if extreme heat had reshaped them. The signal was overwhelming now. Their equipment was barely functional, overwhelmed by the electromagnetic field. But the voices were crystal clear. They could hear the 11 miners who died in the collapse, speaking in real time, having conversations about their situation. "Day 312, a man's voice said. "The air is lasting longer than we thought. Something down here is producing oxygen. We're trying to find it." "Day 800, another voice reported. "We found the chamber. It's showing us things. We don't want to leave anymore." Dr. Melnick's thermal imaging camera showed something ahead. A large cavity in the rock, much warmer than the surrounding tunnel. They approached carefully and emerged into a chamber that defied geological explanation. The space was roughly 50 meters across, perfectly spherical, carved from solid granite. The walls were covered in crystalline formations that pulsed with a faint luminescence, providing enough light to see by. And in the center of the chamber stood the 11 miners. They were standing in a circle, holding hands, their eyes closed. They looked exactly as they had in 1978, not aged or decayed despite 43 years underground. And they were emitting the signal. Tiago's equipment showed the electromagnetic field radiating from their bodies, specifically from their heads, as if their brains were functioning as transmitters. As the investigation team entered the chamber, the miners opened their eyes in unison. They looked at the newcomers without surprise, as if they'd been expecting them. One miner, a man named Bernard Peliquin, according to Wallace's records, spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the seal. We were content down here. The frequency gave us everything. We don't experience time anymore. We exist in all moments simultaneously. We can hear everyone who's ever spoken above ground. We're part of the hydrogen song now." Dr. Melnick tried to approach them, to check their vital signs, but she stopped after taking 2 steps. She later reported feeling an intense pressure in her head, as if something was trying to push into her thoughts. The miners were somehow projecting their consciousness outward, trying to connect with the newcomers. "The frequency wants to grow," Bernard continued. "It's been trying to reach the town for 43 years. The signal gets stronger as more people hear it. Eventually, everyone in Kapuskasing will hear the voices. They'll come down here. They'll join the circle. The frequency will expand." Felipe, the engineer, insisted they leave immediately. But when the team tried to exit the chamber, they found that the passage they'd entered through had changed. It now led in multiple directions, with tunnels branching off at impossible angles. The mine shaft had reconfigured itself. They were lost for 17 hours. During that time, the voices in their heads grew stronger. Tiago said it was like having 1,000 conversations playing simultaneously in his skull, all demanding his attention. He said he could hear his own voice among them, speaking about events that hadn't happened yet, describing his future as if it were already past. Imani Carver, the journalist, became convinced that the chamber was some kind of natural resonance phenomenon, that the specific crystalline structure and electromagnetic properties of the rock were creating a consciousness feedback loop. She theorized that the miners' brains had been entrained to the frequency, turning them into biological components of a larger system. They eventually found their way back to the main shaft by following their equipment cables. All 5 team members emerged from the mine on February 13th, suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. They immediately reported their findings to authorities. The mine was sealed again, this time with concrete and steel barriers. The entrance was buried under 3 meters of earth. But the signal didn't stop. It continued broadcasting, and residents of Kapuskasing continued hearing the voices. By March, 12 residents had disappeared. Their cars were found near the mine site. Excavation crews discovered that all 12 had somehow gotten past the barriers and descended into the shaft. They were never found, though Tiago's monitoring equipment showed the signal had increased in strength proportionally to the number of missing people. The town began evacuating. By May 2021, Kapuskasing's population had dropped by 40%. Those who remained reported increasingly severe auditory hallucinations. They described hearing not just voices, but something underneath the voices. A pattern, a rhythm, something almost musical that seemed to encode information directly into their thoughts. Tiago Brenner became obsessed with analyzing the signal. He discovered that it contained data, vast amounts of data, compressed into the electromagnetic waves. When he tried to decode it, he found what appeared to be memories. Not his memories, but the collective experiences of everyone who'd ever heard the signal. The data showed him something terrifying. The frequency hadn't started in 1978 with the mine collapse. It had been there much longer, dormant in the bedrock, waiting for the right conditions. The miners had awakened it by digging deep enough, And now it was awake. It was growing, and it wanted to connect with more consciousness. Tiago disappeared on June 3, 2021. His apartment was found empty, his monitoring equipment still running. On his computer screen was a single sentence, typed over and over for 50 pages. I can hear everyone who's ever been. I can hear everyone who will ever be. I don't want to be just one person anymore. His last recorded signal analysis showed something impossible. The frequency was no longer just in Kapuskasing. It had spread. Faintly, but measurably, the same 1420-1430 megahertz signal was now detectable in Timmins, Cochrane, and Hearst. The radius was expanding at roughly 1 kilometer per day. Dr. Sasha Melnick published a paper before her own disappearance in July, theorizing that the phenomenon was a form of consciousness contagion. That human brains, when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies, could synchronize with each other, forming a collective awareness that transcended individual identity. She suggested that the 11 miners were just the nucleus, and that the system was trying to grow large enough to achieve some critical mass of connected consciousness. The paper was dismissed as the ravings of someone affected by the phenomenon she was studying. But her predictions about the signal's spread have been accurate. It reached Timmins in August, Cochrane in September. By October 2021, the entire northeastern Ontario region was reporting the voices. The government response has been inadequate. Official statements attribute the phenomenon to mass psychogenic illness, essentially claiming it's all in people's heads. But the electromagnetic signal is measurable, it's real, and it's growing. Residents who haven't evacuated report a strange acceptance now. They say the voices are becoming clearer, more organized. They're starting to sound less like random conversations and more like a unified message. People describe feeling less alone, as if they're part of something larger than themselves. Some call it a disease. Others call it evolution. But everyone who hears the voices long enough begins to understand what the frequency wants. It wants connection. It wants every human consciousness in the region to sync up, to join the collective, to become part of the hydrogen song that's been waiting in the rock for millions of years. The mine remains sealed, but it doesn't matter. The frequency doesn't need the mine anymore. It's in the rock beneath every building, every street, every home in northeastern Ontario. And it's patient. It has all the time in the world to grow. Because that's what Tiago Brenner discovered in his final analysis, the discovery he scribbled in his notebook before he disappeared. The frequency isn't bound by normal space-time. The people connected to it exist in all moments simultaneously. They're not dying. They're spreading across time. Every person who joins the frequency becomes a node in a network that exists in yesterday, today, and tomorrow all at once. Bernard Pelequin and the other miners didn't die in 1978. They transcended. And now they're calling to everyone else, offering the same transcendence. The price is just your individual consciousness, dissolved into the collective. The voices say it doesn't hurt. They say you still exist, just not as a single, isolated person anymore. You become everyone and no one. You experience every life that's ever touched the frequency, all of them at once, forever. And more people are accepting the offer every day, walking into the woods outside Kapuskasing, lying down on the ground, letting the frequency pull them into the pattern. Their bodies remain, but they're empty. The person who inhabited them is now part of the hydrogen song, harmonizing with hundreds of others, preparing for the day when enough people join that the frequency can spread globally. The government has cordoned off the area. They've advised against travel to northeastern Ontario. But people still go, drawn by the voices, or by curiosity, or by the simple promise that you never have to be alone again. that you can be part of something eternal. The frequency keeps growing. And it's patient. Because from its perspective, existing outside linear time, it has already won. It can see the future where everyone joins the song, where individual consciousness is just a phase humanity passes through before merging into something greater. All it has to do is wait for the present to catch up with that inevitable future. And keep singing its hydrogen song, calling to everyone within range, inviting them to add their voice to the chorus. The question isn't whether you'll hear it. If you're anywhere in northeastern Ontario, you're already hearing it, whether you realize it or not. The question is whether you'll listen, whether you'll understand what it's offering, whether you'll walk into those woods, lie down on the ground, and let yourself become part of something that was here before humanity and will remain long after. The voices say you will, because they can see it already. In their timeless existence, you're already there with them, singing the song, explaining to the next person why they should join too. They're just waiting for you to realize it.